I walked into my parents' driveway and saw my brother sitting in the driver's seat of my food truck grinning like he'd won something. He had the window down. He had his elbow resting on the door frame the way you do when you're comfortable, when you're settled in, when the vehicle beneath you already feels like yours and you're just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. My mother was standing at the front of the truck with her arms crossed and a look on her face I knew well. The look of someone who has made a decision and is bracing for the objection. She held up the key and said, "Ricky needs a fresh start, Jolene. Lord knows he's earned one. He's earned one." I want you to sit with those words for a moment. My brother Ricky, who had not held a job for more than 8 months at any stretch in the previous decade, who had borrowed money from my parents, from my aunt, from a cousin who still brings it up at Thanksgiving, who had 3 different business ideas in the last 5 years that each ended the same way. That man had earned something. I had spent 14 years building that truck into a business. 14 years of 4:30 in the morning, of fryer grease in my hair, of county fair weekends and church parking lot Saturdays and every 4th of July without a day off because 4th of July is money, and when you own a food truck, money is what you get up for. I had paid off every dollar of the original loan myself. The title was in my name. The business license was in my name. The health permits, and the insurance, and the commissary agreement, and the vendor contracts for every festival within 40 miles of this town were in my name. And my mother was holding up the key. If you've ever worked yourself to the bone while someone else expected to enjoy the rewards for free, subscribe to this channel right now. Because people our age know what it means to build something with nothing but your own 2 hands and your own stubborn refusal to quit. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. I need to tell you what that truck meant before I tell you what I did, because without that you won't fully understand the moment. I bought the truck 3 years after my divorce, using savings I had accumulated by working double shifts at a diner for 2 years and by living in an apartment so small my cats had to take turns in the kitchen. The divorce had taken most of what my marriage had built, which was not as much as I had thought it was. And at 53 years old I was starting over in the particular exhausting way that starting over feels when you don't have the luxury of time on your side. The truck was a 1994 step van that the previous owner had used as a plumbing supply vehicle. It needed everything. I learned to cook on a commercial scale by watching videos and making mistakes on people who were generous enough to keep coming back. I learned permits and regulations by calling city offices and asking questions that probably sounded foolish. I learned event scheduling by showing up to things and talking to people and figuring out who made the decisions. I did all of it alone, which is both the worst way and the best way to learn anything, because there is no one to fall back on, and so you don't fall back. I built a menu around what I could do well in a small space, a barbecue sandwich that people drove 30 minutes for, a corn salad that a local paper wrote about once, a peach cobbler I made from my grandmother's recipe that came out of the oven at the end of a long service, smelling like every good thing about summer. I had regulars who showed up every weekend at every fair I worked. I had people who found me at one event and looked up my schedule and followed me to the next one. I had a Facebook page with 4,000 followers and reviews that made me feel, on the days when I was too tired to feel much of anything, like the work had been worth every single one of those 4:30 mornings. I had never once asked my parents for a single dollar toward any of it. Not when the compressor failed in July of 2018, not when I had to replace the generator, not when the permit fees went up, and I had to cut into savings to cover them. I handled it. I want to be clear about that. Ricky had asked and been given more than I will ever know the full sum of. Not all of it in amounts that were discussed openly. Some of it in the way money moves in families when one child is always in crisis and the parents have decided that preventing crisis is their job. A few thousand here, a vehicle there. A month of bills covered during one of the rough patches that were, for Ricky, more or less continuous. My mother once told me, when I gently raised the subject, that she and my father were just trying to make sure he had what he needed to get on his feet. I had said, once, that he had been on the verge of getting on his feet for 15 years, and she had looked at me in a way that told me the conversation was over. Subscribe right now if this story already has something burning in your chest, because what Ricky said before he reached for that ignition is the line that ended something in me permanently. Stay with me. Ricky got out of the truck while my mother and I were talking. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, and that particular expression he has. The one that's confident in the way of someone who has always been caught and always been forgiven, so the catching doesn't scare him anymore. He looked at me and he said, "You can always start over, Jolene. You're good at struggling." That was the sentence. Said lightly, almost cheerfully, the way you say something when you've decided it's not important. "You're good at struggling." As though the 14 years were just evidence of a talent I had for hardship, and not evidence of 140,000 hours of actual work. My father, who had been on the porch watching, said nothing. My mother said, "Ricky just needs the opportunity." She reached over and touched the truck side panel the way you touch something when you're claiming it has already been decided. Ricky took a step toward the driver's door. I took a step back. I pulled out my phone. I called 911. Stay with me. Because the look on my brother's face when the first police cruiser turned onto my parents' street was worth every 4:30 morning I had ever suffered through. And I want to know in the comments, would you have made that call? Tell me honestly. The dispatcher answered and I reported, calmly and clearly, that my vehicle was being taken without my authorization. I gave the make and the model and the license plate number, which I knew from memory because it is my truck and I know everything about it. I gave my parents' address. I said I was on the premises. I said the vehicle had not yet moved, but that an individual was attempting to take it. Then I stood there. I did not scream. I did not argue with my mother, who was looking at me with an expression that was moving rapidly between disbelief and fury. I did not engage with Ricky, who had stepped away from the driver's door and was standing with his hands still in his pockets doing the calculation. The look of a man deciding whether to be outraged or afraid and landing somewhere between both. 2 officers arrived in under 10 minutes. The first one, a young man, maybe 30, professional and unhurried, asked me to explain the situation. I did. Title in my name. Business in my name. No agreement, written or verbal, had been made to transfer any ownership. No money had been exchanged. I had not given anyone permission to use or take the vehicle. I showed him my driver's license and the photo of the title document I kept in my phone for exactly these kinds of situations, because I had learned long ago that having documentation on your phone is simply practical. He looked at the title. He looked at Ricky. He asked Ricky for his version. Ricky said it was a family arrangement. He said his parents had promised him the truck. He said Jolene was overreacting. He said this was a private family matter and he wasn't sure the police needed to be involved. The officer said, very evenly, that if the registered owner had reported a vehicle as being taken without permission, that was something they did need to be involved in. If you believe hard work should never be handed away to the family screw-up just to keep the peace, subscribe right now. Because too many responsible people spend their lives being punished for being dependable. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. My mother said she couldn't believe I had done this. She said it in the voice she uses when I have crossed a line she thought was clearly drawn. The voice of someone who genuinely cannot reconcile what they're seeing with the version of me they had in their heads. She said I had embarrassed the family. She said Ricky needed this. I said, he doesn't need my truck. He needs to build his own. She said, you always have to make everything so hard. I said, I made 14 years of 4:30 mornings so easy that you forgot they happened. The second officer had been speaking with Ricky near the back of the truck. He came over to where we were standing and said that based on the documentation, the vehicle legally belonged to me and there was no basis for anyone else to take it without my consent. He said that if I wanted to pursue a theft report formally, I could, and that if I chose not to, the matter would be documented. He looked at Ricky while he said this, and Ricky, who had been leaning toward outrage, looked at the ground. I did not pursue the theft report. I want to be honest about why. Not because I forgave it, but because I decided that what I wanted was not to put my brother in a cell. What I wanted was for him to understand, for the first time in his life, that my things were not available to him. That my work was not a resource his family could access when they decided he needed it. That my name on a title meant something real and final, and not subject to revision by people who thought their desire for him to have something was equivalent to a legal claim. I got in the truck. I drove it home. The next morning I was up at 4:30, which is when I am always up and have been for 14 years. I made coffee in the truck's small setup the way I always do before a long service day. The particular smell of the machine warming, the quiet of the parking lot before anyone else has arrived, that specific early morning stillness that belongs to people who get up before the world does. I had a festival that weekend, and the prep list was 3 pages, and the corn was at the perfect point in the season, and I had made a batch of the peach cobbler the night before that had come out exactly right, the way it does when everything else is working the way it should. My brother never started that engine. My parents eventually stopped calling. Not because anything was resolved, but because there was nothing left to resolve on their terms, and they don't do well with terms that aren't their own. I know they love me. I have never doubted that. What I know now, more clearly than I ever let myself know before, is that love without respect is just sentiment. And sentiment doesn't run a business. I built everything in that truck myself. It survived the divorce, and the lean years, and the 4:30 mornings, and the county fairs in the August heat, and 14 years of nobody helping me, and nobody needing to. My brother never got to start that engine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't ask anyone's permission to protect what was mine. If this story touched your heart tonight, subscribe and come back tomorrow. Because some people confuse kindness with weakness, until consequences finally arrive. And the day you stop being confused about the difference is the day everything changes.